Maria wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at the small clock above the door. The lunch crowd had thinned, and only a few regulars lingered at the tables. She loved this time of day when the restaurant seemed quieter and she could take a breath. Before the dinner rush, she moved behind the counter, arranging cups and napkins and thinking about her plans for the evening when the bell above the door jingled, signaling a new customer. She looked up and saw a man in a dark tailored suit with sunglasses despite the cloudy afternoon. He had the kind of presence that made people stop talking and glance at him even in a crowded room. She smiled politely and approached him with the usual greeting, but he simply nodded and took a seat at the corner table closest to the kitchen. Maria noticed that the waitstaff seemed to move a little slower around him, as if sensing he was someone not to be trifled with. She kept her composure and approached with the menu, confident in her own professionalism. Her Italian lessons from her grandmother had always stayed with her, and when the man looked up and asked a question in Italian, she instinctively answered in fluent Italian without thinking. It was a warm, melodic response, and it seemed to catch him off guard. He raised an eyebrow and smiled for the first time. Maria felt a strange mix of excitement and fear. In that instant, she quickly scribbled down his order, repeating it in Italian to ensure she got it right, while her heart raced. He could feel eyes watching from a distance, and she knew something about him demanded respect or perhaps caution. She returned to the counter to prepare his meal, taking care not to show any signs of nervousness. Her co-workers whispered behind their hands and exchanged glances, but she pretended not to notice, focusing instead on the tasks at hand. The kitchen seemed hotter than usual, and every sound of chopping or sizzling felt amplified. She tried to block out the tension around her and just cook. She remembered the stories her grandfather had told her about powerful men in town who could either help or ruin someone with a single decision. Those stories seemed distant and fictional until now, until she felt it could be real. The man spoke quietly in Italian with a few words punctuated by gestures, and she repeated back her understanding, trying not to make mistakes. Hours seemed to pass slowly as she delivered drinks and small dishes, checking on his needs discreetly. He did not seem rushed nor demanding, but there was a weight in the air that made every movement deliberate. Every time she glanced at him, he seemed to be studying her as much as she was observing him. Maria told herself it was just good manners. But there was a sharp intelligence in his eyes that suggested something more complex than casual dining. The restaurant continued with its usual rhythm of laughter and conversation, but there was a line of tension connecting the two tables, as if the world had shifted slightly for that corner. She felt both nervous and oddly proud of herself for responding correctly in Italian. She finished the final touches on his order and carried the plate to his table with a careful smile. He nodded again and said something in Italian that made her heart skip a beat. She understood the meaning clearly and quietly. She replied with a single word. Her co-workers lingered at the edges of the kitchen, exchanging puzzled glances and whispers. As if sensing the unusual nature of this encounter, Maria returned to her station and tried to focus on other customers, but the presence of the man hung over her like a shadow. She had a sense that nothing about the next few hours would be ordinary. She continued to move through the motions of her job, aware that the small act of speaking her grandmother's language had shifted something unseen yet undeniable in the air. The afternoon slowly edged toward evening, and the restaurant began to fill again with families, couples, and a few business people. Maria moved between tables carrying trays of food and refilling glasses while keeping an eye on the man in the corner, whose presence seemed to dominate the room. She tried not to stare, but she could feel him watching her from time to time, his eyes calculating and almost unreadable. There was a quiet intensity in the way he held himself, as if every movement mattered, and every glance was part of some larger plan. She reminded herself to stay calm and professional, even though her stomach had tightened since he first walked in. The air felt heavier around him, as if the ordinary sounds of the restaurant were muted in his presence. Maria returned to the counter to refill a pot of coffee when she noticed one of her co-workers whispering to another. They were hesitant, and their expressions carried a mixture of awe and unease. She ignored them and focused on the task at hand, making sure every cup and plate was spotless and every order accurate. Her grandmother had always said that composure was the key to dignity, and Maria repeated the words to herself silently as she moved behind the counter. The man called her over in Italian, and she approached trying to keep her hands steady. She could hear the faint undertone of amusement in his voice that made her pause. He asked a few questions about the menu and the ingredients, and she responded fluently while adding small gestures of explanation to make her answers clear. He nodded approvingly, and Maria felt a small surge of pride mixed with apprehension. She walked back to the kitchen with his order and felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The other customers seemed oblivious to the tension, but Maria could sense a subtle change in the staff. She placed the plate carefully on the counter and glanced at the clock. The hours seemed to stretch longer than normal, and she realized that dinner service had become a slow, deliberate test of her patience and focus. She moved from table to table, attending to other customers, while sneaking glances at the man in the corner. Each time she looked, he was observing her with that same unreadable expression. She tried to tell herself it was just curiosity, but something deeper seemed to be at play. The kitchen phone rang, and Maria answered quickly. It was a reservation question, but the voice on the other end seemed distant and hurried. She jotted down the information and hung up, trying not to think too much about it. The man called again in Italian, and this time she noticed a slight smile on his face. He asked something unexpected about her life outside of work. Maria hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to reveal, but she decided to keep her answers simple and polite. She felt a strange connection forming in the words shared in Italian, as if the language itself created a private channel between them. Every motion she made was careful and deliberate, and she felt the weight of responsibility in every step. She noticed the clock ticking and realized that the restaurant was approaching closing time, yet he remained calm, patient, and deliberate in his actions. There was a subtle power in the way he carried himself that Maria could not ignore. She had served many demanding customers before, but none that commanded attention without a single raised voice or abrupt movement. The last few hours felt surreal, as if time itself had slowed around that table. She prepared his dessert and brought it to him with a soft smile. He looked at her and said something in Italian that made her pause and understand that he had noticed her skill, her composure, and perhaps something deeper that could not be measured. She nodded slightly in response and turned back to the kitchen, trying to steady her racing heart. She realized that the encounter had changed something inside her, a mix of fear, excitement, and curiosity that she could not quite name. She cleaned the counters and stacked dishes, mechanically while replaying every detail of their interaction in her mind. The final few minutes of service approached, and Maria sensed that whatever came next would carry consequences far beyond the simple act of taking an order or speaking. In Italian, she felt a quiet anticipation that something significant was about to unfold, and she could not predict whether it would be a blessing or a warning. The restaurant was nearly empty now, and the sound of chairs scraping and dishes clinking echoed softly in the evening air. Maria moved methodically through the remaining cleanup, aware that the man in the corner had finished his meal, but had not yet left. He sat back in his chair with a slow, deliberate motion, as if measuring the passage of time. She approached cautiously, carrying the check and a polite smile. He looked up at her and spoke in Italian with a tone that was calm, yet carried an unmistakable weight. Maria felt her heart race as she understood the meaning instantly. It was not a question. It was a statement, and somehow it felt like a judgment. She nodded quietly and replied with measured words, choosing each carefully aware that any misstep could change everything. He gestured for her to come closer, and she hesitated. For a moment before stepping forward, her breath was steadying despite the nervous flutter in her chest. The other staff had already begun closing procedures and were casting occasional glances in her direction, sensing the unusual gravity in the room. He leaned back slightly and said a few more words in Italian. Maria understood enough to grasp the implication that her actions earlier had impressed him, but that her caution and composure were being tested further. She maintained eye contact and felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. In that instant, the clock on the wall ticked toward closing time, and yet the atmosphere around the corner table seemed suspended as if ordinary rules no longer applied. Maria felt a sudden clarity about why her grandmother had insisted on learning the language and carrying herself with dignity. She realized that speaking Italian had not only connected her to him,